Testing, testing. I think this works, more or less. Hello and welcome to my special summer school, a sort of online lecture series which I came up with when I realized that at artist talks I always feel like I don't get to touch on everything I wanted to mention, and I always over-prepared. There's just not enough time, I have too many interests. But then I realized that on the internet I can do what I want. So here we are, thank you for tuning in. Today I would like to talk about animation. If you've heard me talk about animation before, you may know that this can reach a variety of intensities. I will try to make this a smooth journey that veers on the side of informative, but also has some wildness sprinkled in. I will do most of this by live streaming, well actually not live streaming, just showing you my desktop and going through a bunch of files, videos, animation making methods, and see what comes out at the other end of it. Let's go. Let's get a big one out of the way. I made this meme some months ago about what happens when I get into a situation in which I get to explain the differences between cinematic and animatic movement. And actually, even some years ago, literally years ago, I made this other meme that is about my tendency to talk about trains, Thomas Lamar, and radical perspectivalism in any given normal conversation about animation. The fact that I made this so long ago, I can't even remember, at least 4 years, I think really illustrates my attachment to this concept of cinematic versus animatic, and how this really underpins everything that I think about when I think about animation. There's different ways of explaining this. I tend to use 2 videos as sort of illustrative examples in talks that I do. These slides are from a talk I gave at Two Queens 2 years ago in the summer when I showed my video openings there. So cinematic movement, according to the system for different perspectives and modes of motion that Thomas Lamar outlines in his brilliant book, The Anime Machine, which I really highly recommend that you read, and I'm sure it will come up again in this talk. So, there's this, both of these videos were recorded on the Kyoto Tango Tetsudo, or Kyoto Tango Yura Tetsudo, which is a private rail company that runs a short route at the top of Kyoto Prefecture in the north. Cinematic motion is, or cinematic movement, is when, as if you are sitting at the front of the train, speeding into the landscape itself as if you were a bullet cutting through the material of the word. You really get this sense of everything being organized against one singular vanishing point off in the future, and you're sort of being drawn into it in this sense that you also get to maintain your integrity as the viewer because of the strong here and not here relationships that this perspective establishes. Whereas in animatic movement, it's more like viewing the landscape from a side window of the train, in which you see the multiple layers of the landscape, like there's the mountains, here there's the river, there's the construction work, and there's the land in the front, and then there's the electric poles and the wires, and then the trees, and they are all sliding against each other at different speeds. It's almost as if this word, according to animatic motion, is made up of multiple discrete layers that have different gaps in between them and slide at different speeds to create an illusion of something that is like a 3D immersive space, but actually has little gaps in between the layers that make it up. And, obviously, the real world, even if I look at it from the side of the train window, it has, there's land between the layers, it is all technically connected, but it's about this illusion of the sliding layers. And, this is just another slide from this same talk that is my drawings of a dissected scene from the first Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood opening, in which you see the characters walking along the top of this hill, and then the landscape sort of spins out and has this really like immersive, intense vastness, but at the same time, you can tell that these are flat layers. Like it doesn't try to hide and build this illusory depth of the cinematic one point perspective. And I drew this sort of model of how the scene must have been constructed because I wanted to recreate it, but I think it's a really good way of illustrating a word that is constructed according to like animatic perspectivalism, in that it may appear as a whole from certain points of view, but it does ultimately have gaps in between them, and you can always see where the seams are, like no matter how smooth the experience is. These are the basics of the differences between cinematic and animatic movement. There's a lot to extrapolate from this, and also I want to say that this is not a sort of essentialism, but rather like two kinds of movement that can be present in moving image made through all sorts of techniques. It doesn't have to be, like not everything filmed by a camera is going to be cinematic, and not everything animated is going to be animatic. But generally, cinematic, animatic, it's all about the layers, the flatness, and slipping in between said layers. I think a lot of it comes down to circumventing a sort of self versus other binary Cartesian setup that this sort of like illusory depth viewer versus what's being viewed sort of image pertains to. And I feel like that in the animatic setup, when you do get to participate in the slippage into the layers, the image is not so much perceived as like felt straight inside the body. I think this slippage is similar to the sort of affect that horror can produce, has the same sort of primacy of, like being horrified before your mind comprehends what it's being horrified by. It's a raw feeling, and I think a well-constructed animatic image has the same capacity for evoking that feeling. And well, since the meme that I pulled up originally mentioned radical perspectivalism, I will touch on this briefly, is that, so in Lamar's definition, radical perspectivalism is the name that he coins for the phenomenon in which, if you have this word that's made up of multiple layers, the layers, the ways they are drawn and the ways they are placed, they all have their internal lines of perspective. But in this sort of like collaged animatic landscape, you can have a sort of totality that includes multiple oppositional perspectival lines within it, and that is what he refers to as radical perspectivalism, this capacity to include multiple lines of sight within one image word. Getting over all of that, now I would like to talk a bit about my personal interests. I mean, this whole thing is about my personal interests, but yeah, so despite what you may think, because of my profession and art practice, I suppose, I do watch a lot of anime, but I don't watch as much as you would think. I'm more of a reader, actually, than a watcher, which is just who I am as a person and how I've been since I've been very young. But when I do watch things, I do watch them very intensely. And one of my most favourite animated pieces of media of all time is Shinkai Makoto's 2007 film 5 centimeters per second. This film, the story is roughly about this boy and a girl who they start out in like primary school, and they're quite close friends, but then the girl's family moves to a nearby prefecture and they get separated by like a 3-hour train ride, and then later the boy's family moves to this small island in the south of Japan, and they get separated by like a much more considerable distance. And it's basically about dealing with this distance and then how their relationship sort of deteriorates, and, longing and connection. And one of my most favorite animated sequences of all time is at the end of this film. The film ends... Well, I'm going to play part of this. So the film ends when the characters are now adults, and they don't have a relationship with each other anymore, and then it kind of ends at this point, and it's sort of an introspective looking back on their past. actually this whole scene bit that we just played, where it starts with like, yesterday I had a dream of a long time ago, I actually used that line in my film About Their Distance. It's the starting line of that film. I had a dream yesterday. A dream of a long time ago. All of my films are like massive Shinkai Makoto simp works, but I think to this day About Their Distance is my Shinkai Makoto simp-est artwork. So basically, there's this little monologue about a shared dream that they both have about their childhood, and then the film ends with this musical sequence that kind of starts out sort of linearly, and you see them as adults, and then as the song progresses, it dives further back into the past, I think roughly after these birds fly away, and then it becomes this montage of like collapsed time and space, where all the different spaces, Tokyo and Tochigi, the nearby prefecture, and Kagoshima prefecture in the south of Japan, all sort of exist in the same place and same time. And you see various little snippets of the characters' stories that may not have necessarily been in the film before, and it sort of ends with this overarching sense of disconnection and longing. And I find this really effective for a number of reasons. Part of it is like the way it's edited to music is really emotive, and the way it sort of, it doesn't really rehash the film as a music video, it really adds something new to it, which, and what it actually adds, I will talk a bit about in a later section. But one of the things I love the most about this segment, well, I love many things about this segment, is that the song that plays in the background is called One More Time, One More Chance from Yamazaki Masayoshi. And that song actually was not written for this film. It's a song from, I don't know, 10 years before the film came out. And actually the film was like being developed, and it actually came out as like 3 segments. Like there's the segment where they're in primary school, and then there's a segment where about the boy's life on the island, and then there's a 3rd segment when they're both adults. And as they were developing it, Shinkai was not sure how to finish the film, and like exactly what kind of resolution could express what he wants to express with the film. And he was walking around his neighborhood as he was like developing it, going to his local convenience store, and there's a convenience store chain called Lawson that actually plays this song One More Time, One More Chance quite frequently in its playlist. It's like a little MIDI cover that they play. And then he went to the convenience store to, I don't know, pick up a snack or whatever, and he heard the song. And then he had this vision of how the song fits perfectly with what he wants to express in the film. And I think this moment of serendipity where something that was created by someone else's words, matching exactly what you want to say in the present moment, I find that something that really relates to my experience of sort of like trying to express how you see the word through the words and expressions of others before you, and it's this kind of like collaged sense of like all these things coming together. And I think this really adds to how the ending sequence is portrayed from all these somewhat disparate segments. And ultimately what the film and the ending of the film is about, so the film currently you can see ends with the characters passing each other at a rail crossing that is near where they grew up as children. They don't have a relationship anymore, so they kind of both like startled and look back at each other, but then the train comes and disrupts the view. And well, you shall see that when the trains leave, Akari, the girl, is gone, and this is basically the way the film ends. And then Takaki, the guy, sort of, feels dejected, but then also kind of, he has like a mild smile at the end, and then he crosses over. And I see this as a really beautiful positive ending. People tend to be frustrated with this as like, oh, nothing happened, what is this? But I think, that's not the point. This is not a love story. This is a story about looking for someone or something, and what Takaki is looking for is not Akari, he's looking for a connection, being able to fully connect with someone, fully communicate with someone. And I love this ambiguity and the fact that, it's suggested that Akari has kind of moved on, or she has her other connections, and then kind of Takaki is able to, make peace with the situation at the end by accepting this disconnect that I think will later allow him to connect to others in a more meaningful way. This whole thing of looking for something or someone that you're not quite sure where it is, and even in places where the someone or something could absolutely not be, which is what the song is about, is something that is really driven through all of Shinkai's films. It's particularly interesting how it's expressed at the end of Your Name, his film that kind of gave him big commercial success, especially overseas. And I just love this sequence. I think it's masterfully expressed. I love how the animation is done. I love how it works with the music. I love how it compresses narrative space into a little montage, and this is going to become relevant later. And I love how much the film connects to something that feels absolutely integral to it, this song, but it was not made for it. It's this sort of unexpected connection that was found by the creator, and this way the film itself is entangled with its own creation. If you look through it, you may be able to recognize some scenes. For example, this one. This is a scene that I sort of tried to recreate in my film openings. And there's a lot in here that I have tried to recreate in my films because I have not stopped thinking about the sequence since I was very young. I first saw this film when I was 13, and I have been obsessed with it since. To finish off this segment, I will show you one more scene that I have recreated in my videos. This is in About Their Distance. It's this scene. This is one of my most favourite parts. There's this whole thing with Shinkai films about trains. I think this may have added to my train obsession in life in general. But sort of him signalling disconnect through trains passing in between characters. And this is very obviously a thing at the end, where they are literally separated by the train car, and then also in the segment that I just showed where one of them is on the train but the other is on the platform, and is just, they can't do anything but watch as the train is speeding past. And also in one of his first film, The Voices of a Distant Star, there's a very intense sequence where a character sort of hallucinates herself through this alien race, and then the two visions of herself are separated by a freight train running past. Now that we have established a sort of base inquiry and interest into animation, which, as you know, I have a tendency to map out onto literally everything else, let's get into the actual making of the animation. This is not about how animation is produced in general terms. That's a whole big thing, a whole industry, with whole teams working on projects, and I can only speak for myself. In line with the previous talking of layers and irregular parts, the bit of my work I enjoy the most is consolidating things that were not meant to be consolidated, combining disparate segments into a semi-cohesive image word. This can be as simple as just taking one image or one video I've taken in a place and inserting my animated avatar into it, or it can be a literal complex collage of drawn elements, my avatar, anime screenshots, and pictures of all sorts of different places in geographically disparate locations. As far as terms go, the animation I deal with most often is called compositing, which you can think of as a sort of video collage, and the main point is that it's a place where different elements are put together. The software I use for this is Adobe After Effects. Adobe still has an iron grip on the compositing industry, I guess. There's not really many alternatives that kind of do everything that I want After Effects to do for me. You can do certain aspects of it in different softwares. A good alternative I have tried before, which is free up to a certain point, is DaVinci Fusion. It did do a lot of the things that I use After Effects for, and it was fairly satisfying and fun to work with, but it does have a very, very different workflow, a very different interface. It's a node-based editing system for some bizarre reason, so I don't see myself making a full swap anytime soon. I guess I'm stuck paying Adobe all of my money. Sometimes I'm asked about my workflow and how I plan towards my longer videos, and this may be something we cover at a different point in more detail. But basically, it's usually either two things. One thing is, which is what I will illustrate here, is that I, for example, may have a picture from a place that I have taken and I have a good idea for an animated scene for it. Or I may have an idea for a video, like for example, but this is something like based on vibes. Like for example, for my video openings, which I completed in 2022, I believe, the whole video started because I drew this graph in my sketchbook at the time, because I had a conversation with a friend who said that all anime openings are the same, and this really upset me, and then it made me think about anime openings in more detail, and then I thought, trains, openings, and video game loading sequences, they all have the same spirit. And then I drew this graph that kind of connects them in a circle, and then I drew these three exclamation marks in the middle, which I kind of identified as the shared spirit. And I knew at that point that I want to make a video about those exclamation marks. And then approximately a year later, openings went out into the world. So usually I start with something as vague as this. I don't have like a full storyboard in my head. I don't have like a good idea of like, oh yeah, I'm having this scene and it will go at this point in the script and this will be said and these things will be connected in this and that and those ways. And this is usually something that starts from like much more fragmented parts in the beginning, and then as I go through the making process, the video making is actually quite time consuming, as you may have guessed. And as I'm working on it, I keep mulling over the ideas, I keep thinking harder about why I want to animate certain scenes, and then the sort of structure of the longer video arises through these processes. Here, I chose, for this example, I chose this photo I took in Wakayama, which is in central Japan, in a town called Mihama, which is partially where the anime and game called Air takes place. I went there in the spring and I got some fairly good footage there. And Air is a piece of media, both as a game and as an anime, that are very important to me for a number of reasons. It's kind of up there with 5 centimeters per second. And I really wanted to make a scene in particular that makes use of the sort of concrete seaside wall that features quite heavily in Air. And I managed to get some photos of the local equivalent. Allow for a brief tangent here. So, for example, this scene I'm about to prepare is quite simple and non-consequential. My vision is that I will use this like seaside thing and then my character will sit on it and then there will be some hair animation. But it really allows me to mull at Air and the seaside wall and why it's important for me to look at these things. And for example, this particular wall is really interesting to me because of the visual reference to what like the heart of Air is about. So Air is, as a story, it's quite intense, but to sum it up briefly, it's about this girl, Misuzu, who is the protagonist, and she keeps having this feeling that there's another version of herself that lives in the sky. There's also a male protagonist, Yukito, who is traveling throughout Japan looking for a girl with wings, which is sort of like going off based on this story that he kind of inherited from his mother. And it's about their meeting. A lot of the visuals of the anime and the game make use of the sea, the sky, and looking towards these faraway lands, while sensing that something that is beyond human is behind those landscapes. And here I thought I would play a scene from the anime, which is the scene of the protagonists meeting for the first time. I'm already gone and nearly in tears just hearing the song. So yeah, the protagonists meet on this seaside wall, and Yukito, who is having sort of a nap, wakes up and then sees Misuzu, who is taking on the wind and staring at the sky. This is really significant for like story reasons, but also I find it conceptually significant and interesting because I was reading this essay. So as a little baseline knowledge, so there's this theorist in Japan called Azuma Hiroki who has outlined this framework for media consumption that he calls like database consumption. There's an English translation of the book that he wrote about this. It's good in many ways and not so good in many ways. It's worth a read. But basically he outlines this theory that a lot of like subculture fans, otaku, when they consume media, they don't consume the media itself. What they consume actually is there's this like underlying subcultural database of various parts that often show up in these stories, and then what they consume is on the level of the database rather than the media itself. So for example, with Misuzu, like we have a character who, I don't know, has like a schoolgirl uniform, has blonde hair and blue eyes. That's a sort of character trope. There's also other characters that, you know, have like quiet speaking voice and are like more of a bookish character, or like if you think of like a character with pigtails or a character with cat ears, like there's all these little segments that can come together to make up a character, and all sorts of narrative elements that can come together to make up a story. And Azuma talks about the database in the sense of these elements being consumed, and when you're within this database level of consumption, you're kind of mixing and matching these different parts and then consuming them as sort of symbols rather than interacting with the material itself. And he kind of draws sort of fatalistic conclusions in this about, like, I don't know, the post-modern state and how people look at things, and then this like grand loss of narrative and innate value, which I find a bit extreme. But anyway, I was reading an essay about air from this guy called Kurose Yohei, who is an artist and a theorist, and I am somewhat reluctant to be intrigued by his theories because of his somewhat recent sexual harassment scandal. But anyway, he wrote this essay in which he talks about this particular introductory scene of Misuzu, in which she is seen looking at the sky, and the anime is actually a very good echoing of how we first encounter her in the game. We basically have like the same CGI. And what he finds interesting is that Misuzu, who is sort of kind of like very central to this whole like database consumption sort of subculture, because the game is like from a very particular game studio. And we see her looking at the sky, and her looking at the sky and what's beyond the sky is really like narratively significant, but instead of the camera being positioned behind her and allowing us to see the sky that she is also seeing, what we see is her looking. And then in the essay, Kurose goes on to talk about how he feels like it's sort of like what we're looking at with Misuzu, and the sky behind her, which is not the sky that she's looking at, is sort of the underlying database that Azuma theorizes, that kind of funnels into her as a being, and then the database is perceiving something else that we are not privy to. Obviously in the anime we get different shots of Misuzu looking at the sky, and we do see her from all sorts of angles. It's just, I guess it's just the nature of how a compelling visual narrative is put together. But I did find this really interesting, and it made me think about things being looked at and the action of looking, and then perceiving this act of looking, and just finding it really interesting that it can be very significant to the story what is being looked at, and yet it cannot be shown, and how that actually carries a lot of wonder. This fact of like not defying what is being looked at is kind of more visually enticing and truer to the like the central mystery of the narrative than actually like seeing the sky as it is being perceived set within the frame. And for me this is really interesting in terms of my interest in how we may perceive things that are possibly unperceivable within the human perceptual system, like, you know, stuff like perceiving the sky. I can look at the sky, but am I understanding it? I don't think so. And also it's just thinking of like cloud-like systems and this like sublime, maybe everything is about the sublime for me these days, is the thought that I always end up on. But anyway, by working on the scene and me wanting to make this scene to explore these ideas, even though it's something as simple as me taking my picture of the seaside and then drawing into it, it allows a meditation on like where I am, where the avatar is, the real place, the animated place, the connection of these two places, and then me being in the middle, sort of with the camera trying to enter, and also the all sorts of like synergies and connections that take place as I'm like between me and the surface of my drawing pad, the sky seen from my studio window from my local park, the sky I saw in Mihama, which was actually not very blue, and then the sky that I'm about to animate, which is the sky that my character, who is also me but not quite me, is looking at. I'm really interested in all these relationships, and these really come out in these simple scenes. So in the actual work, usually I would take the base picture I have. Often I work from a picture I use as a basis, or like a sort of compositional setup, even if I make it from different pictures that I collage together. And often I would use Procreate on my iPad to draw out the layout of the animation. Procreate is a sort of like Photoshop-like drawing software, but with way less functionality. It's really focused on like digital drawing and digital painting. It's really good. It's a one-time £10 payment. It's excellent for what it does, and it has a really smooth like animation interface, which makes it really easy to like sketch out motion, go back and forth between different frames, and then test out how things move together. It's a lot less clunky than Photoshop's timeline, for example. However, I do have a major beef with Procreate in that, one, I mean, this is a very boring detail, but in my work, I like for my drawn avatar bits to have really crisp pixelated edges. The Procreate brushes I have been trying to customize don't really allow for crispness in the same way that the Photoshop pencil brush allows for. And also, coloring in is absolutely painful in Procreate. I can't really comprehend why they made it like that. It makes no sense to me. If you've ever colored in Photoshop but also in Procreate, you probably know what I'm talking about. I think it's just like really backwards and unintuitive. But I digress. So usually I would sketch out the animation over there and then take it into Photoshop to draw the actual frames, but sometimes I start in Photoshop itself. It depends on my mood and where my iPad is and whether it's charged. So here I would have the picture, and then I kind of draw the outline of the animation in like rough terms, and then I go back in and then I draw the actual every individual frame's line work, and then I do the coloring in for every frame. Here in this example, there's not actually that many moving parts. It's just the hair and the clothes, which I'm like medium good at this point, I feel like. And I think these are actually quite good things to animate with fairly simple animation and like quite good time performance in terms of how much time you put into it and in the affect of the animation that comes out at the end. And here I would also possibly do things like cut out the sky and cut out just the sea and the sea wall, if those are the only things I'm using. But those are things that I can do later in After Effects as well. As I'm drawing, usually I'm using this massive drawing pad. It's a Wacom drawing pad that I got with money from Arts Council England when I got my Develop Your Creative Practice grant. Thank you, Arts Council. I really love this drawing pad. It's huge. As I'm drawing, I'm usually putting on some kind of playlist or an audiobook. If there's a playlist, often there's some kind of karaoke happening in the room as well. In my work, I usually tend towards fragmented, calm animation, not like cohesive, intense visual narrative. Like I don't really do multiple camera angles of the same shot or like many connecting shots of linear movement. And this is partially because of resource constraints. Like most spectacularly choreographed animated sequences have teams of people working on them, which I do not have. And also there's skill constraints as I'm not professionally trained and I'm just making it up as I go along. But I also think that there's like a specificity to this fragmented approach that feels more effective at conveying what I want to convey in my videos. And I find this more effective than a linear narrative would be. Again, this ties back to the cinematic totalitarianism that I kind of alluded to in the beginning, like leaving no holes nothing left within the narrative, like, I don't know, everything is kind of neatly tied up into one singular timeline and you can't really digress and enjoy the word for what it is. But what I really want is for there to be a space to sit with the discrepancy of the word, and I want for there to be confusion. Recently, actually, I was reading a book that's a sort of recap of Deleuze's cinema, and I feel like I cracked it, or rather Deleuze cracked it, in that he kind of, well, he talks about movement image and time image and everything, and we don't have to get very intense about it, but he kind of talks about duration as something that's kind of opposed to how time may be understood in a very, I don't know, like linear and exact sense. He bases this theory based on Bergson's reading of time. And the short version, I believe, is that he kind of establishes that there is the sort of time where, you know, you can look at like a piece of footage and then you can stop it at like every second and then you get a different frame, and then, like, I don't know, every second has exactly 1 second inside it. So it's like the inside of it can be captured, and like a linear scene can sort of be split into smaller different segments, and what's inside it will always remain inside it. But if you have something with lots of like disparate segments, like a montage of scenes that don't necessarily connect together, the montage itself has a duration that if you break it into its composing parts, the time inside the duration will be lost. Like, the duration cannot be reduced further. It's a sort of totality, and I feel like this is easier to conceptualize if you kind of think about something like, I don't know, like an emotional travel sequence in a film. Like, the sequence itself has this like compressed sense of time inside it, and if you broke it down into every single little flashback and scene that makes it up, an individual scene would not have the essence that the montage itself has. And I feel like this is basically it. This is what makes the 5 centimeter second sequence hit so hard. This is why the anime openings hit so hard. Like, the work is about the word of the work, not the actual storyline in the work, and I feel like the montage format is a really good way of compressing something down into its like word-making components as opposed to its narrative component. And this is also why I don't think that like 5 centimeters per second, the film itself, is like a singular narrative of one love story. Like, it's about disconnect and futility on huge planetary scales, and about like contending with the flow of time, contending with these like major planetary bodies that kind of show up at the film in unexpected parts. And I think this is all interconnected with like how Deleuze talks about duration in cinema. And actually a lot of this is this sort of like non-linear communication and non-linear ways of thinking, non-linear editing of things together to produce something that kind of takes you beyond what a linear framework can contain. Like, this is a very simple thing, but like, to me, in my heart, it kind of links to the reason why I make all my work, and which is because I'm trying to convey something that I can't really find a way to convey in any other way. And I find that these disparate editing sequences in my videos are like the most effective way of communicating something that ultimately cannot be communicated, or at least not so far. And it links to one of my most favorite manga panels, which is from Blue Period, in which the protagonist kind of feels this disconnect between himself and his friends, and then never quite finds this like genuine communication. And he ends up sort of drawing this picture of how he perceives the atmosphere of like Shibuya, a period of Tokyo, in the early mornings. And then his friends are looking at this drawing and then sort of saying, oh, I get that, that is what it looks like. And he kind of comes to tears and then internally thinks that it says, I felt like I had a proper conversation for the first time in my life. Yeah, exactly. And this is what it's all about. This desire to break down the absolute territory, the disconnect between two human subjects. And in my own work, what I want to communicate is made up of many different parts. And what I want to convey is the connection of these different parts in some ways that may not come out in speech. And that's why I make video. For this next part, we're gonna take what we worked on in Photoshop, the prepared layers, and take them into After Effects, which is the software of my choice for actually putting the animation and video together. You can import a Photoshop file quite easily, and it will have all the layers inside it if you choose the right settings when importing. I then copy these out and put them into a blank composition that is set to the shape and size of the video that I seek to make. So here the first 5 layers are the character drawings that I did. It's 5 frames of animation, and that's gonna be the hair animation on a loop. And if you're not familiar with After Effects, so basically the way it works is that you have all of these layers on top of each other. What's on top of the list is going to be visible on top of the other stuff, and there's various parameters inside, like anchor point, position, scale, opacity, and you shall see that, you know, if I move the position, the numbers at position will change. There's these little stopwatches next to every parameter. You can click on this and it creates a keyframe. And a keyframe is basically a data point in the timeline that memorizes the data at that point in time. Here for us, this is the position. And if I make another one at a different point in time in a different place, then what After Effects does essentially is that it takes these 2 keyframes and then calculates what needs to happen between them for them to go from A to B. And this is basically the logic that After Effects uses for everything, and this is how even more complex animations are assembled within it. So for achieving the looping hair animation here, I'm going to use the opacity quality out of these bits, and then I'm going to basically turn the keyframes on for every single layer in the hair animation, and then I'm gonna make just one of them visible, move a bit further down in time, mark its visibility point, and then in the next frame make it invisible. This makes it flip from visible to invisible. Then I go to the next layer and I make that flip into visibility at that same point. So the frames of animation are changing up each other. Then I'm going to repeat this process for the rest of the frames. You can do this by copy and pasting the keyframes, and then I will also add a final keyframe to kind of mark the zone of this looping transitional animation. This will be clear why this is needed later. So we have one loop, or like one round of motion. Then to make this repeat forever, I could just go on keyframing indefinitely, or I can also use what's called an expression, and it lets you add a piece of code basically into the property of opacity, and I'm adding this code that makes it loop everything that's between the first and last keyframe of that property, and I will repeat this for all of the layers, and this way I get looping animation without having to do 5 billion keyframe copying by hand, and it works pretty well. And then you can pre-compose these once they are done, also known as nesting, and I just kind of make a composition of these things so it's all just one layer in the timeline and much easier to see what's happening. It looks pretty decent, I think. Then I would like for there to be a shadow of this, so I'm going to duplicate the figure. Usually this is how I do shadows of the figure, and then I flip it vertically or horizontally. I can never remember which one is which. Anyway, I flip it upside down. You see I made a mistake and had to undo it. So we shall do this flip, and then there's an effect that you can apply to this, which is called fill. You can usually find it in the effects and presets menu. That's usually on the right hand side. If you know what effect you're looking for, you can type in the name or you can look through the folders. So I will apply this to my shadow self, and this turns the layer a single color, basically. It's red by default, but obviously I'm going to change it to black, and then kind of adjust the shape and position so it looks like a somewhat realistic shadow. You can do quite intense distortions on this if you get shadows and like light shining from different angles. And I like to duplicate the actual figure for this because often there's some animation on the figure, and this way the animation also is retained for the shadow itself, which is like a nice touch. I'm also going to add a blur to this. There's lots of things in the blur folder, as you can see, but I'm going to use a Gaussian blur because it's a good standard one. And then you can control things like how many pixels on the edge are blurred and so on. And once this is done, I'm going to apply a mask to this. A mask is kind of like, you can draw these shapes with the pen tool, and they cut out part of the image. Here you can see what I made the little mask around has been cut out, but I'm going to change the type of the mask, so actually it removes this from the image, and then I can feather this mask that makes the edges fuzzy, and I can make a sort of disappearing effect as if the shadow is kind of, fading out. And then usually this is how I achieve shadow stuff. I'm gonna do various customizations here, like cutting off the edge of the shadow, for example, changing the shape of the shadow mask to make the disappearing look more lifelike, and then changing the layer opacity to make it partially translucent. And I would say I'm more or less happy with this at this stage. This scene this is basically what I wanted to do, but I thought this scene is quite a good example of how my work is put together and how you can work with multiple layers in a singular animated image. As you can see, this scene is made up of the sea roll underneath, and then this sky photo I put inside. So here's the sea roll, that's from a picture cut out slightly. And then behind I can insert whatever sky I want, but basically I think I want the sky to also be animated, so I'm going to use this file I prepared some time ago for my video openings, in which I had some really particular cloud animations. So I'm gonna use this file, and you shall see it here. I'm importing it so it has all the layers inside, and you shall see, so it's just this image I made. The background is a bit weird looking because I did some strange stuff to it, but that's gonna get deleted soon enough. But it's just some clouds I painted. I think I painted this in Clip Studio Pro, which is like a one-time purchase software. I got it on a good discount, and it's really good for digital painting. And there's been some brushes in there that are very good for drawing clouds in particular. So I have all the clouds on individual layers, and I also have the larger clouds you can see at the bottom. That's a sort of separate static layer that I'm going to be using. I'm going to copy all of these basically, and actually no, I'm not going to copy them. I'm going to do it here. So I'm going to take every cloud in this composition, move it to the bottom of the screen, because I want them to be all moving as if they are all moving across the sky. So I will take the position property, mark it down at the beginning out of the screen, and then go down 5 seconds or so, and then pull it to the other end of the screen, and a keyframe is created there. And this way we have the cloud slowly moving across the sky. Now I'm going to do this for every other cloud, and here also there's some ones that are like near the edge, so they have hard edges. These I can kind of use the masking tool to cut around them so they are usable in this moving composition. Then once all of this is done, I'm going to, because they're all moving at the same time, because I made them all go from the bottom to the top at the same time, I'm gonna stagger their starting times so that they kind of are at different phases of movement, so it looks like the sky is filled with clouds as opposed to having just one big cloud group moving all at once. And then, once this is done, I'm going to open the position property back for all of them, and I'm going to do the same thing I did with the hair animation, with the loop property, the loop expression, and then this will mean that the clouds are going to go from bottom of the screen to top of the screen, and then loop back to the bottom, go to the top again, loop back to the bottom, go to the top again. And this will mean continuous movement infinitely. Nice. So this is the same method I used for doing the clouds in openings as well, by the way. So now that the clouds are done, we shall go back to our original composition and insert this layer of clouds. You can put a composition inside another composition. There's no limitations on anything whatsoever. I will stagger the start time so you can see them nicely. And here's our clouds in the background. Now, I would like for this to feel a bit more three-dimensional than this, so I can turn this into a 3D layer, which you can do by clicking the little cube box. And if I open up the properties, you can see that there's a lot more options for us now, because 3D space has become a thing that exists for this layer. So you will see I'm now rotating it in 3D space, so it's kind of disappearing backwards. And this will get a sense that the clouds are kind of rolling out towards us. You can, in the 3D setup, you can usually move the layer around with these arrows and rotate it with these circular markers. That makes life quite a bit easier. And then I shall copy in the static bottom layer of clouds. It's kind of like a fog on the horizon. I guess that's relatively realistic. I thought that would be good to have for this as well. And then doing all sorts of adjustments, of course. I also had this gradient made that kind of makes the horizon blend into the clouds better. I guess that's usually how things are at sea. And now, to make a cloud layer, I'm going to make what is called a solid. What this is just basically a simple image of a color that's usually the same size as your composition. I made it red so it's easy to tell what's happening. So I add this in the background, and then I'm going to apply an effect to it to make a gradient. And with this gradient effect, you can use it on anything basically, but it's good to use on solids or other blank pictures. It starts with like a black and white default, and it makes a gradient between these 2 points. Here you can see me pulling the bottom bit around. I'll set this at the horizon. And the color at the bottom is going to be like a light blue. And the color at the top is going to be like a darker blue for the sky. There's lots of adjustments I could do here, and also I could possibly do a multiple point gradient, but for now this is going to work. And there we have our blue sky, and basically the video is done for our purposes. There's obviously things that we could adjust, like for example it could be quite exciting to have some kind of camera movement where the camera zooms into the image, and then the sky stays the same size and the figure stays large, so it's kind of, you get a stronger sense of depth and going into the image itself. But for our purposes this is done and can be rendered. You add it to the render queue, set the settings for it. For me it's a standard MP4, and then you can choose a name and location to save. Video done, bam, this is basically my practice. And now for the rest, I thought of showing some other examples, because well, first of all, I think it's good to be transparent about the processes you use, because I find these very exciting and I find it really fun to make. So it's really fun also for me to share, obviously. But also because I think so much of my work is about thinking about animation, doing the animation, but also I think there's a very specific thinking that you achieve through doing the animation. And looking at these compositions is a very good way of figuring out what I mean when I talk about the layers and the multiplicity. So I'm going to go into an older project file in After Effects that I used for my most recent video border as interface, and just show you some of the assets that I have in there that I have used. So so far we've used like the drawn character, and then I animated the sky with my cloud paintings, and then I use these real life photos in my works. But often I paint other bits as well. Not super often actually, but sometimes it happens. I have this file of a train I painted, for example. This is the train that passes in the final scene of 5 centimeters per second. Is the same model. And I painted this version of it I painted like a front car, a middle car, a back car, and then these connecting units so it can be assembled in any length for my purposes. And then I put this into like a longer composition in which I connected the train cars into a big line. So this is my train. I think it's just called like train long in the composition names. And I have been incorporating this into videos for a while. I've actually used it in openings, I think, this same file. I often reuse assets because, well, A, they take a long time to make, and B, I quite like them and I would like to use them again. So if I find the right file, I can show you an example of this painted asset being used. So I made this composition, which is kind of reminiscent of this train bridge crossing over a small stream that shows up in the anime Air opening. And so I'm using that here with some of these floating screens that I love to put into places. And basically, so I have the base image, which is just a picture I took in this place. It's not where the Air opening is based on, but it looks a lot like it. Actually, the place in the Air opening, the bridge has already fallen in, so it's out of use. But I separated the top object out from the background object. This is so I can put the floating screens in and they will be under the rail bridge and the pipe thing. And then, as the video progresses, I have like a slow camera movement that's just done by me moving the layers around. And also I have a bunch of effects on the little floating screens. These are probably some customized version of the pre-made After Effects effect called Bad TV. It's really fun for like adding noise and some fun colors and wriggly movements to things that are meant to look like screens, basically. And then at the end, you can see I have my train coming in. So it starts here. You can see the rectangle approaching. It's that massive thing coming from backwards in 3D space. The angle is quite wild. And you see the train comes in as if it was a real train going along the tracks, and then it goes away. Done. Then for the next one, this is a slightly more complex one and quite a good example of one that's not really based on any real photograph. So it's actually based on a scene from an anime called Anohana, which I'm quite fond of. It's a scene where the characters sort of have like a meltdown together on a mountain. It's really emotional and intense, and I just really like the composition of that, so I really wanted to use it. I've had it saved on my computer forever. But basically it's really hard to source a real life photograph that will match the vibe, so I took it upon myself to assemble it from various different parts. So the way this is done is that I have the foreground grass, which is assembled from 2 videos of grass I have taken in 2 different locations. This is grass I videoed in Tanegashima in the south of Japan, which is partially, where 5 centimeters per second takes place. And then I have a second video of grass overlaid that I videoed at my grandma, like near the mountain, at my grandma's village in the Hungarian countryside. And then I have these trees and also these rocks that, oh no, the rocks are from a different thing. But, so I have the trees that come from these screenshots of Ghost of Tsushima, the game. I just took these photos and screenshots on my PlayStation, so these are where the trees are from. And then I believe the rocks are also coming from Ghost of Tsushima. And also the bushes, actually. A lot of the bushes are the ginkgo trees with the yellow leaves in Ghost of Tsushima that I kind of altered the colors of and green screened out the sky, which is really easy to separate from the yellow leaves. And then you just alter the colors and then they look like bushes or like green trees. It's a really fun way of using it. Here you can see how the effects are put together with the green screen on top and then various color adjustments. I use these curves effects a lot for adjusting color and various things. It's a fun way of using assets that are very different from the final vibe of the scene. Then all the little things floating are either scenes from Border's interface to video or screenshots from past videos. The one kind of far off in the back is actually from a video I made for my degree show, the good old days. And then you shall see that the background has these mountains in it. This is from a photo I took at near the top of Mount Zao, which is in the northeast of Japan. I was just there for tourism, but I just love that lake. And there's also this other file hidden here that I was considering as a possible background image, but then in the end I couldn't really make it work. It's the launch pads of like the Tanegashima Space Center. It would have looked pretty cool without the mountains, but it's just, it doesn't quite have the right foreshortening, I guess. It just didn't fit. Then I'm using this planet I made in Photoshop some time ago because I needed a massive planet for openings. And I've been reusing it since with some edits on it. And the sky is this image of a condensation trail that I took somewhere. I'm not sure where. Possibly in the south of Japan. And then, while in the original scene we have 5 characters, I have my one character in the same 5 poses, and the scene is kind of cycling through these same poses. There's also some light effects on the scene for the final render, but I cannot show you those now because they come from like a paid effect pack kind of thing, and I haven't renewed my subscription, so I can't access them right now, but I will renew because it's really good. It's the Maxon 1 red giant effect. Is the trap code suit that I use quite a lot. It's very good for like glows and lens flares. Another scene as an example that uses the same train setup is this one that I have done before. This one also uses like one drawn character as always, and then there's some shadows on the character to make it blend a bit better. And I think the railway crossing is actually taken from a scene from Voices of a Distant Star. I cut it out from a screenshot of that. And then I tried to kind of recreate the same scene, but with my own methods. Here's some light effects on the front, and then there's the blinking lights that I also added myself. These are basically just like masked from solids and then kind of made to flicker via opacity changes. And then finally the big train layer comes in, and I think it's turned to black to look like the shadow of the train. As one of the closing examples, I was gonna also show this scene, which is also based on an anime scene from The Day I Became God, which I don't know, enjoyment, yeah, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about, but I enjoyed many aspects of it. This is not the place to talk about that, but anyway, there was a particular scene in the anime that I took a screenshot of, which you can kind of see here. Let's see if I can show you the full thing without the mask. So this is the original screenshot. I just really loved it with these floating screens, and I was really into these anime made-up interfaces at the time. I still am. So I thought of recreating this, and actually in my version I ended up using some parts of it literally cut out. So you see I have literal cutouts of the original scene, and then I incorporated bits like, in this cutout for example, the original includes a brain scan, but I happen to have some scans of my own brain, so I hunted those down and I inserted them into the screen. Here's the full scans. I think the eyeballs are really funny looking. It's like the eyes emoji, which I love to use extensively. Who knew that this would come in handy in the future in an art project? Then for the rest, I have some screens that I kind of like drew the frames for myself. I inserted a screenshot from a game that is relevant. I inserted a bit of a video that is relevant. And there's also a video of one of the starting scenes of Border's interface. I love to put scenes from the same video onto screens within the video. I just love that little meta touch. And also it's like a fun visual callback. I'm quite happy with how this scene turned out. And then I think for the final thing, maybe I added some kind of camera animation by just like panning across the scene. But basically I get a lot of my inspiration from just watching stuff. Like I wasn't watching The Day I Became God for inspiration. I was just watching it because it's a key anime. And then I found this scene really compelling, even though I found the anime at large not so compelling. Okay, final example. So I went to this station at some point during my daily life, and I really liked this end bit of it. So I took these pictures where you can see the platform from various different angles. And then I had the idea of basically assembling a scene from all of these different photos I took. This one is one of the more complex ones, I suppose. I'm gonna try and turn off some of the background layers so it's a bit easier to see what's happening. But it's quite an intense one. So basically, we have these floating screens as always, kind of just videos tilted in 3D space, some of them game recordings from Ghost of Tsushima. Then I took these photos of the station and I cut them into different parts. So I have a different segment for the front of the platform, then what's seen from the platform without seeing any of the gates. And then obviously I have the figure standing at the end of the platform. And I removed the background, which I replaced as well. Oh yeah, and here you can see the rest of the platform kind of being blended into the end bit, which I actually took from a different photograph. And now you can see the replacement sky I have, which is actually, we can go into the composition. So this is the replacement sky. It's basically a zoomed in version of this photo with some colors manipulated, and then these clouds I cut out from a screenshot from the video game Air, and then I'm having this kind of slowly move across the sky. You don't see the cut off hard edge in the full composition. It's kind of funny to look at it isolated. So I have these sections of the platform, and then I also have these shadows added that I kind of just drew out myself with the pen tool from a solid, and then I have the figures shadow done in the same way that we did it for the air wall composition. The sea wall composition, sorry, from Air. And I also have some extra shadows added onto the character so it looks like it's blending in better. And basically for the animation throughout this scene, I think at first I wanted to set up like a proper 3D scene, but it seemed a bit too laborious for what I needed actually. And it's kind of the motion, which it looks like you're kind of going into 3D space. It's kind of just like done manually via increasing the size of every element at different speeds. And then obviously the floating screens, they are in 3D space, so I'm just making them slide out. And then eventually you zoom in. And I think this is quite a good example of a relatively complex way of putting a scene together from something as simple as a starting photograph. And roughly this is where I want to end. I just wanted to show all these examples and basically talk through them to kind of show the way I gather materials, what these materials look like for example my anime screenshots, and how the gathering of the materials is a sort of process that's kind of similar to the animation itself, in that when I'm gathering these things, I'm not just like taking a screenshot, I'm immediately dissecting the screenshot of like how was this actually put together, because After Effects is actually the compositing software they use in most of anime production for like effects and stuff, and like putting the different layers together, and then trying to kind of reverse engineer something I'm looking at to then normal engineer the scene again with my touch on it. And then this kind of always relates back to the multi-layered questionings that I have going on in the work. And often it's something like as unrelated as like just finding the inspiration in really unexpected places, basically. And this really relates to the whole thinking animation, doing animation, thinking through doing animation thing. And it's really important to me, the layering and intensity that are present in both the image creation and the preparatory stages. And these are things that are not just in my practice, but in both the practices of like commercial animation and the animation studios, and then the ways the fans interact with the materials. Like these things, it's kind of relating back to the whole database thing with Azuma. And how the material is not just the material, like there's so much more under it. And these interactions are taking place on so many different scales and levels at the same time. This is what I find really interesting. And animation is particularly interesting to me because just by the fact that, like, for example, when I'm recreating this, like, going into the one-point perspective image, like with my platform image, for example, that's a very cinematic perspective. But it's kind of recreated without actual 3D depth in the image. So it's even if it looks exactly like it has 3D depth, because it's handmade, it's kind of like it includes a sort of meta commentary on the nature of that cinematic perspective just by default, because it has to be made by hand. So it's like, even if in stuff like a lot of animation is used to recreate cinematic stuff, and then like stuff that looks like just like if it was filmed by a camera, but the difference, even if it looked the same, and that sometimes is done without thought, but like just the material itself already contains this meta discourse because it has to be made from scratch. So it's like, because everything is possible from the get-go, it's always going to automatically tell a story about constraints and the choices that get made and the choices that do not get made, what gets depicted and how. And it's this sort of shifting dynamic that I find really interesting. And this is basically why I continue to make videos and find video a really interesting genre to begin with. And I think this is long enough as it is, and I really hope this was insightful in some ways, and not just a way for me to dump all my interests on you, basically. I could talk for a long time, obviously. But this is just a sort of intro to why I think animation matters a lot and the way I approach it in my practice. So maybe you got some fun things to think about and some practical skills, possibly. And I'm going to end this video the same way I often end my talks, which is with these two screenshots from this Full Metal Alchemist film, The Conqueror of Shambhala, which is a very interesting film, I really recommend. But it's these bits that say, "Then I will continue to make films, dazzling daydreams of another world that cannot be." Thank you for tuning in, and see you in a future episode.